So I use visuals. I hope that helps for people. It helps me to kind of stay focused. But I will shut them off when we do our discussion. And I will try to leave about a half an hour at least for discussion tonight, because I know there's always people on these calls who know more than I do about some of these topics. And we always learn from each other. And so I always want to leave a lot of room for that so we can learn with each other. And sort of the spirit of the Maurin Academy, we're inspired by Peter Maurin, and one of his ideas was to have roundtable discussions where people could get together and share their ideas. So that's what we do. This is a talk about the papal encyclical Laudato Si, which means praise be to you. And the subtitle is on the care of our common home. So he doesn't use the term environment in the title, which I kind of like. It's our common home. And I've always thought that environment sounded kind of instrumental, but our common home, it sounds like what it actually is, not something to be just used up or kind of to be in, but something that we're a part of and that sustains us all. Of course, Pope Francis named himself, his inspiration for his papal name was St. Francis of Assisi. And you'll find in this encyclical quite a few references to St. Francis, who was in tune with nature. He says of St. Francis that he refused to turn reality into an object simply to be used and controlled. This was Pope Francis's first encyclical that he wrote wholly by himself. Lumen Fide was the technical first, but it was co-authored with Benedict XVI, his predecessor. I want to mention a few more things before I go on into this, though. I want to remind people of two upcoming events. The first one on April 6th is my political philosophy talk. And this one's about Thomas Aquinas. So that happens on the first Thursday of each month, basically. And I take on a different topic. The next thing I want to mention is that Bryant McFarlane will be teaching a class, and it's called On the Sublime and the Beautiful, the Impact of the Technological Sublime. And that starts on April 12th, and it's a 4-week course. I'll be doing an interview with Bryant a little bit later on so that people who watch my channel can get a little bit of a feel for what that course is going to be about. But I know he's going to talk about Burke and Kant and then move his way forward on this concept of the sublime. So keep an eye out for those things. All right, I wanted to mention a couple of other things kind of related to this encyclical in case people are unaware. There is a film that's available and it's out there for free pretty much everywhere, but you can find it on YouTube. And it is called The Letter because that's what an encyclical is. It's a papal letter. And it's pretty good. I have a mind maybe play a little bit of it. I've got maybe a 3-minute segment, which I'll play in just a minute so you can get a feel for it. But it's put out by the Vatican, and it has a website that is put together by the Dicastery for promoting integral human development. And I got on that website, and it has a web tool that you can use to kind of get an action plan. And of course, I'm intensely curious about these things. So I tried to sign up, and it was hard, like, to get it to generate an action plan. It was basically I was interacting with an algorithm, and I couldn't get past the first page until day 3 when it finally worked for me. And I'll show you a page from it. But I think the fact that it boils down to a website interface, working or not, is an indication of how deeply enmeshed we are in direct mass communication with all the attending problems associated with that. In other words, we understand that, the church has to communicate with people this way to reach them directly. And I think Pope Francis is really interested in that. At the same time, there's no substitute for direct human organization and contact. And so it was a little bit of a strange experience. Here's just some items in the action plan that was generated for the Maurin Academy. And this is just in the area of ecological spirituality. So there are a lot of different categories, and I couldn't share them all, but this is what came out of the sort of action plan tool that came off of that website. And the reason why I put this up on the screen is because you'll see that most, if not all of these items are related to, in this case, how the church would communicate Laudato Si and sort of like the values and themes of it. Okay. And later on in this presentation, and probably next week, I'll talk a little bit more about this too. But I would love it if churches would kind of go beyond this kind of advocacy to actual action. And any of you have stuck around for a while know that about me, right? So I'm always looking for, are you, what is actually happening at that level, right? Is it about just teaching people, or is it about actually organizing to do something? And actually, most of the items on the action plan were aimed at the individual, which is another thing I look for. Are you talking about changes that individuals can make, which are good, but in the encyclical, Pope Francis certainly argues that individual changes aren't good enough. It also, though, does ask people to basically engage in advocacy, appropriate political advocacy, but it's pretty soft on that. And that also, I guess I would just say, just a sort of like maybe as a little bit of food for thought for a later discussion, we've got tons of organizations asking for advocacy and for individual change. I don't know if we need any more. And there's a lot of people engaged in those things. And I think that there's so much going on there that, maybe no more even needs to be done on that level. It isn't necessarily effective. So I'm always looking for our churches, and in this case, the Catholic Church, organizing to actually do something along these lines above and beyond just teaching. Another emanation of the encyclical is the Laudato Si movement. And it is geared especially to getting young people involved in advocacy and action on the environment. It calls for things like divestment in fossil fuels and political advocacy at multiple levels. So it is another form of outreach on this issue. All right, so now that I've kind of made those brief contextual introductions, I want to get into the encyclical itself. It's not very big. It consists of 6 chapters. I'm going to talk about the introduction and 3 chapters tonight, the first 3. And just up front, I guess I would say this contains information that I think that Catholics and other Christians should hear. My experience and my impression is that most don't hear it because it is not taught in the churches. Now, I'm sure that there are some Catholic churches out there where it is taught and where action does happen. But here in the Midwest, and I would dare say probably in a lot of the country, it's really not. You could go for years and not hear about this teaching. So I would just say, a frustration again, papal teachings don't matter if Catholics and other Christians only get to hear watered down versions, or maybe nothing at all. I'll also say that this encyclical was particularly controversial. When it came out in 2015, it was criticized both by people outside of the church and in the church. It wasn't necessarily accepted by other people in the church hierarchy. There were and are divisions amongst leaders in the church about whether to emphasize this. It was criticized as being sort of almost socialist. It was criticized for being too liberal. It was, in some quarters, criticized for being too conservative, too political, not political enough, et cetera. So it got its share of criticism. But in this brief introduction, Pope Francis tells us who he is addressing. So he's not really addressing just the Catholic Church or the people in it. He's going beyond that, and he very consciously says, I'm addressing everybody on this planet, and it doesn't matter, if they are Catholics or even Christians or where they are on the planet. And he mentions that he's in context or in dialogue with a lot of other churches and religious groups and civic groups, and many of them are on board with the general, values of this trying to preserve the environment. He also notes that previous popes have raised the alarm on the environmental issue, so he's not the first to do that. He's trying to bring context and show that what he's writing is in that context. So he mentions Pope Paul VI, John Paul II, and of course, Benedict XVI. So it's a growing theme within the Catholic Church, responding to obvious changes in our environment. Okay, now, another thing that comes up in this introduction, and I want to slow down here and make sure I fully explain this, because this might be one of the harder concepts to understand for people. But one of the greatest contributions of the Catholic perspective stems from the knowledge imparted by the strong belief in Christ's presence in the Eucharist, which is the Holy Communion, which reminds Catholics of the continuing real presence of God on earth via the incarnation. So literally in the Catholic service, Catholics believe that Christ literally is physically present in the Eucharist during each Mass. The birth, life, and earthly death of Jesus is therefore sort of remembered, and more than remembered, but experienced there. Pope Francis's statement here exemplifies this understanding. And the result, if we see the world this way, is that everything becomes sacred. So that's what he's saying there in this quote about the very flowers of the field and the birds, which Jesus's human eyes contemplated and admired, are now imbued with his radiant presence. Okay. It also establishes the goodness, this Eucharistic or incarnational way of thinking establishes the goodness of our bodily existence and the fact that we are creatures whose bodies are extensions of our souls. Because we are bodily beings, our location matters. We are much more capable and interested in caring for our immediate surroundings because of that. One thing we've experienced in our modern world is a technology-driven detachment from our immediate surroundings, such that our minds are in some other place or no place for a great deal of our lives. And it's like disembodied in the way that we live. One of the action items that caught my attention in the Laudato Si action plan was going out with friends and regularly surveying our immediate environment. And that is, again, a reflection of this incarnational Eucharistic view in which God's presence has entered the world and imbued it with this sacredness. And we are a part of that. And so we should pay attention to it. So going out there and actually observing your environment. How many of us go for walks and we're even then plugged into our headphones, right? We're not really looking around. So something that would have come instinctually and automatically less than a century ago, looking around, is now something that has to be suggested and encouraged. If we did this, we wouldn't need much convincing to believe that our environment was being degraded all the time and that it's a problem. You can tell if you've been on the planet a few decades, you can tell the difference. But when we don't see it, and we don't derive our food from it, our actual sustenance for our bodies. We don't know where it came from, what's going into our mouths. You don't see where any of this is coming from. We can believe it's of no consequence, or even more so, we can just not think about it. I think that's the bigger problem. Okay. So this particular Catholic contribution to our understanding of the environment is actually pretty important. We otherwise we tend to see the environment as something that's other and that is just utilitarian, right? But if we really fully understand Christ's presence in the world, both in his birth, his life, his death, and then his presence in the Holy Spirit and in the Lord's Supper, then you cannot see the world, the environment, and other people and your own body. You can't see these things as somehow separate, right? It's all one, and it's all important, and it's all sacred. So he keeps coming back to that theme. Our bodies and our world, therefore, are not foreign impositions or burdens to just slough off by either death or by technological singularity in which we can just basically get everything done without actually like being connected to our world. From this perspective, our bodily existence matters greatly, and it's good. And it's not just about our sexuality, which is what is usually emphasized by Catholics and other Christians, let's face it, but in every aspect of our physical presence, including our leisure time, our labor, and the extension of our labor, our property. So Francis says this of Jesus's own relationship to his earthly body and his environment. He says, of himself, Jesus said, the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they said, look, a glutton and a drunkard. And Francis said, he was far removed from the philosophies which despise the body, matter, and the things of the world. So this is important to keep in mind when trying to understand his perspective in particular. So right in the introduction then to this encyclical, we have Francis saying that to the extent that we see our bodies and our environments as simply matter to be used and manipulated according to our will, we are sinning. We are treating the continuing presence of God in all things and God's perpetual ownership of his creation as though it's exclusively ours to do with what we want. This means that we have effectively rejected God in our actions, and thus we've rejected who we really are. Thus, we no longer have integrity in the most exact sense. We are falling apart as we do self-destructive things that destroy the environment we rely on, and things that destroy our bodies by disregarding the health and proper use of our bodies. So to kind of boil that down, these three pictures are all related from this perspective. A society that strip mines, that uses up the environment indiscriminately for whatever cheap commercial purposes it determines it wants through the market at that given time, is the same society where people are basically encouraged to disregard their bodies and put into them whatever is on sale at McDonald's that creates obesity and diabetes and causes people to die sooner. And that's the same society that creates a social context in which women feel that they need to have an abortion. Now, people have very different feelings about the issue of abortion, and that's okay. But Pope Francis, of course, is pro-life, and he sees a connection amongst all three of these. Everything is interconnected. And probably if we fixed our attitude towards our environment and respected the world and our bodies as creations of God, and respected each other and supported each other appropriately, we wouldn't have as much of either this or this, if that makes sense. So in our destructive actions, we reject God's incarnation and our own integrity as we disavow the importance and impact of our physical presence. Okay, so if that doesn't totally make sense, that's something that we can talk about more. But it's often the case that Christians, including a lot of Catholic Christians, will focus almost exclusively on one or two things. But I think that Pope Francis's perspective is helpful because he's very much saying, you know, the instrumental view of nature is the same sort of motivation that produces an instrumental view of our bodies and each other's bodies, and of course, ultimately of our reproductive process as well, and everything else. You cannot pick and choose. So, in the introduction, finally, he maintains a position of hope. Towards the end, he realizes that, of the introduction, he realizes that it's very easy to despair, but the Christian position is to not despair, but to have hope. And hope, according to Stanley Hauerwas, who I've been reading recently, is not the same thing as optimism. He says optimism is hope without truth. Hope it involves faith in God, okay? It is a faithful response to a bad situation. If we believe in a good God, we have to have hope, but that doesn't mean that we have to be, you know, a wide-eyed optimist. So Pope Francis says, regrettably, many efforts to seek concrete solutions to the environmental crisis have proved ineffective, not only because of powerful opposition, but also because of a more general lack of interest. Obstructionist attitudes, even on the part of believers, can range from denial of the problem to indifference, nonchalant resignation, or blind confidence in technical solutions. So he understands all the serious, grave obstacles in the way of any sort of change to this. And probably the biggest one is general lack of interest. Your house is on fire. You know, like, I think that this is the question of the day, right? How can people's house be on fire and they're sitting there watching TV, basically, right? And it has to do with that detachment, right? Where, you know, we're almost disembodied. So it goes back to that detachment from the real world. But he says at the end of this introduction, we still do have the ability to work together, and we know things can change, but it's a matter of whether we can help make them change. So just a few words about what happens in chapter 1. It's about what is happening in our common home. So to a certain extent, it's about educating people. He notes that the speed of change in the past few hundred years has been unprecedented and that it has been exponential. So he discusses how the increased pressure on the soil due to changes in the way we farm has led to dangerous depletions that threaten our food supplies. He notes how many people live in a situation where their environment is ugly, dirty, and toxic. He acknowledges the loss of biodiversity due to ongoing extinctions that are human-induced, and observes that the wealthy have a tendency to create artificial zones of beauty and serenity. Amidst this, think meta, you know, and the metaverse, okay, virtual reality, right? Not to mention gated communities. But that most humanity can't do that. They can't afford that. They don't have that. Creating these artificial zones is also a problem simply at the level of rejecting God's creation as inferior to one of our own design. He discusses also the fact that pollution and climate change induced catastrophic weather patterns are factors in our own ongoing mass migration crises that have made many national borders into sources of political and physical conflict. And he talks about how there's two extreme reactions. And I think there are a little bit of straw men here, but just for the sake of like getting the bigger picture, think of it as a spectrum. So on the far right, you have people who do not think that there's a problem. If we have little problems, you know, if some of our technological advancements create environmental problems, no problem, because we can create even more technology to fix those problems. And the market will kind of demand that and make that happen. So they're rather sanguine and, relax. You're catastrophizing if you worry about it. So there's really no need for deep change in the way that we live. On the other end of the spectrum, he says, are the left liberals, you might say, left-leaning people, although what he describes here sounds like an extreme leftist, not a Democrat, okay? But he says those people think that you should more or less eliminate human presence from the planet, should be from the planet, and prohibit development as much as possible. But he says a deep sense of communion with the rest of nature can't be real if our hearts lack tenderness, compassion, and concern for our fellow human beings. So there, I think he's talking about like earth first type of people, like the radical environmentalists who really are almost like human hating, right? And so basically what he wants to do is try to locate the church's position as neither one of those, okay? And I guess, the question for me is he wanting to say that we should sort of have that mean between the two extremes? Or does he want to go beyond the liberal vision? Because these are both liberal positions. They're just left-leaning and right-leaning. I do think that ultimately Pope Francis seems to be calling for a change that's deeper than that goes beyond the liberal political spectrum. Because he's calling for a change in who we are in this encyclical, a rejection of individualistic, self-interested, rights-oriented, and materialistic identity that many around the world have adopted. But he spends most of his time, on both ways of thinking, but I think maybe he spends a little bit more of his time in the left or the left liberal zone, of the moderate left liberal zone, sort of trying to hit that happy medium. And that's probably just because, he has to deal with the real world all the time, right? He has to deal with actual political leaders, and he's trying to influence international policy, and he's working with what's available. But he also wants to remind people, ultimately, the change has to happen at the level of our souls. Okay. Also, in this chapter, he anticipates what most people do, and to a certain extent, what the public emanations even of this encyclical do, and acknowledges that these often get in the way of real change. So he's talking about superficial rhetoric, sporadic acts of philanthropy, which make people feel good but don't actually get a whole lot done, perfunctory expressions of concern that don't go anywhere, or just romantic sort of traditionalism. Okay. None of those get us anywhere, except for they make us feel good. One of the things that the Maurin Academy is consistently about is we're trying to peel people away from just saying and doing things that basically make them feel good, but don't actually get much done. And yes, some of that superficial stuff does end up creating this attitude of, meh, does it really matter, right? Which is kind of exemplified by this latest K-State research, which indicates that knowing where your food comes from is just not something that most people care about. Thanks, K-State. All right, on to chapter 2, Gospel of Creation. In chapter 2, he addresses the tendency Christians have to use the Bible to justify exploiting nature and leaving it without replenishment. So I won't belabor this because I think a lot of us are familiar with the fact that people will use the Bible to justify exploitation of all kinds, right? But to quote him, he says, "We are not God. The earth was here before us and it has been given to us. This allows us to respond to the charge that Judeo-Christian thinking on the basis of the Genesis account, which grants man dominion over the earth, has encouraged the unbridled exploitation of nature by painting him as domineering and destructive by nature. This is not a correct interpretation of the Bible as understood by the church." Okay, so good enough there. But then more interestingly, he talks about the biblical basis for thinking of nature in terms of the laws of nature right? In my field, we tend to use the term the laws of nature to apply to human beings and politics, but actually the natural world is a perfect example of the laws of nature. It has laws of its own, rules that if people break them, bad things happen. We're seeing that with climate change and with the, the unexpected ramping up of all of these catastrophic weather events, right? That is natural punishments, you might say, for the violations of the laws of nature. He finds support for this idea that human beings have to obey the laws of nature in the Bible. So, for instance, he says, God commanded Israel to set aside each seventh day as a day of rest, a Sabbath. Similarly, every 7 years, a sabbatical year was set aside for Israel, a complete rest for the land, when sowing was forbidden and one reaped only what was necessary to live on and to feed one's household. Finally, after 7 weeks of years, which is to say 49 years, the Jubilee was celebrated as a year of general forgiveness and liberty throughout the land for all its inhabitants. So there you have like the law of nature of allowing your land to be fallow and to rest and to be replenished, along with letting yourself rest and be replenished, and allowing for this jubilee of forgiveness every 49 years, where society is sort of relieved from debt, from the debt that has built up, and everything kind of starts over again. Again, the attitude of sort of obeying, respecting, both the environment and the people around you in your actions and the way that you organize your life is revealed there. And here he ties up caring for your land appropriately with caring for the people around you. Again, he says, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field to its very border, neither shall you gather the gleanings after the harvest, and you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. So, and you could imagine this attitude in a variety of ways, not just in your garden or your farm, but in everything that you do, sort of just letting a certain amount of it go. Like if somebody else takes something that you have, to just kind of have the attitude, well, I guess they needed it more than I did. It might lower your blood pressure anyway. Now, that's all to say that Pope Francis thinks that we have developed misguided views on property. And he reminds us that the church's position on property, which goes way back at least to Aquinas and maybe probably before, rejects the claim to absolute ownership, because ultimately God is the ultimate landlord, right? The owner, and the human beings are sort of temporary owners and stewards of that. So, for instance, he quotes the Bible saying, land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine, the Lord says, for you are strangers and sojourners with me. And Francis says, the Christian tradition has never recognized the right to private property as absolute or inviolable, and has stressed the social purpose of all forms of private property. St. John Paul II forcefully reaffirmed this teaching, stating that God gave the earth to the whole human race for the sustenance of all its members without excluding or favoring anyone. These are strong words. And they are, like, if you actually really take that in, they are strong words. The problem is we can sort of like intellectually take them in, but then what do you do with those words? How does that change the way you view your property, your business? I recently did a whole series on D.C. Schindler's The Politics of the Real, and he also expresses this sort of Catholic Christian view of property. He says that he has this term, we realize ourselves through our bodily presence and our extension of that in our property. That property in particular puts us into the public space necessarily, even if it's just that we're a homeowner or we own or live in an apartment and have a car. Anything that we have that we sort of control and supervise that extends out into the world, it becomes a representation of us. It becomes an extension of who we are and represents us to other people in the world. And therefore, we have this responsibility to take care of it as we would take care of ourselves, not to simply instrumentalize it. So his point of view goes along fairly well with this. Spencer and I just did a podcast in which we talked to his aunt, who is a landlord in Kansas City. And it's coming out, it's already, well, no, it will come out as a podcast next week, and it'll be on my YouTube channel about a week later. But we get into her feeling about her properties as a sort of small landowner and small business person there, as opposed to this developer who is coming in right next to her property, who doesn't seem to care whether anybody has a parking space, let alone her tenants, and its presence is literally squeezing out the smaller landowners. She actually feels some ownership in the truest sense of the word and, feeling for her properties. She's there frequently. She communicates with her tenants. She cares whether they are having, mechanical difficulties. She feels responsibility because her properties, it sounded like to me, are a representation of who she is. And she doesn't want to be thought of as somebody who doesn't care about them. And she genuinely appreciates the beauty of them and so on. So this is a human tendency to kind of to create an attachment to that which we own and to want to make it express who we are in our integrity, and not simply use it up. So I think that this is a potential contribution that is somewhat expressed in this encyclical too. Our attitudes towards ownership of property, when they're not properly formed, are idolatry from this perspective, because they become sort of like a tool of power for us to wield over others and to manipulate in a godlike fashion. So if we don't have that more humble view of ownership, we then move into this sort of we're a god type of zone where we are the ones who will decide exactly what to do with that without any limit, ethical, moral, or otherwise. Pope Francis says a spirituality which forgets God as all-powerful and creator is not acceptable. That is how we end up worshiping earthly powers or ourselves, usurping the place of God, even to the point of claiming an unlimited right to trample his creation underfoot. And then he contrasts that with Jesus's attitude of servant and service leadership. Okay. This is not what we, the idolatrous use of property is not what was intended by God, is what he's saying there. Just a note, if you're particularly interested in this discussion of property, the closest thing to a Catholic alternative economic proposal to either socialism or capitalism is something called distributism. And I've done a whole class, summer seminar on distributism. I've put public clips of that up online, or I have the complete recorded class. You can email the Maurin Academy if you'd like to have access to that playlist. But I would recommend, if you haven't heard of it, take a look at it. This is G.K. Chesterton. He was one of the chief advocates of distributism, but it's an idea that originates in the Catholic Church's reaction to the Industrial Revolution. All right, finally, I've got a few more minutes here and I can talk a bit about what goes on in chapter 3, the human roots of the ecological crisis. He says, it's right to be excited by all of our technological advances, and they are not bad in and of themselves, okay? it is definitely what we do with them that matters. And he says, again, when we place ourselves at the center, everything else becomes relative. Everything else that isn't me becomes relative to my goals for myself. And he mentions the elderly there. My dad, who's on this call, and I have had occasion to try to help elderly people with their technology problems. Dad visits people at a hospice house, and he's done other work like that over the years. And oftentimes he notices that they could make phone calls if they only had a device that they could use with their voice to make those calls, whether it was Siri or something else. Or, if they had some way to voice control their television. Or the latest thing that we tried to get into was this one man has he's very soft spoken, and his wife can't even hear him when she visits. And we thought, well, wouldn't it be nice if he had a voice amplifier? Now, what we found is that sometimes those fixes work and sometimes they don't. But what we found is that nursing homes and assisted living facilities are not interested in helping people with that kind of assisted technology, even if they're in very fancy, expensive places. They don't support our efforts to do that. And so what happens is we'll try, but without that extra support on a daily basis, the people can't do things like watch their church service on their own TV that comes on YouTube every week. So they miss church, or they can't make phone calls to their spouse because they can't handle the technology on their own. And all of this goes on, whereas at the same time, what Pope Francis calls the technocratic paradigm is still very firmly in the minds of the people who run these places, because they use it constantly to manage the elderly clients in the homes, okay? So it's not like they're technophobic. They just use it for their own purposes and don't really seem to be all that interested in using it to enhance their clients' actual lives. So that's been a kind of surprising fact that we've learned in trying to help people. It's very reflective of the way that people use technology basically to obtain what they want, but it's not being used in ways that would really genuinely be good. If there's any use for ALEXA, it's to help people who are handicapped. I don't really need one. Obviously, I have one, but I don't need one. Okay. So Pope Francis also points out in this third chapter that we have a real need for knowledge of ethics and morality at a time when these subjects are downgraded in universities, business, and society. Totally. And this is another thing we might want to talk more about if any of you are in a university setting. The humanities and the social sciences are just being like decimated, especially in the United States, where there never has been a whole lot of respect for these subject matters, and there's way less now. And there's this notion of, morality is a personal thing, and doesn't have anything to do with how we organize our business or, our economy or anything else. Pope Francis is calling for more, not less, of that education, for people to be exposed to good, solid ethics. Okay, he says there needs to be a distinctive way of looking at things, a way of thinking, policies, an educational program, a lifestyle, and a spirituality, which together generate resistance to the assault of the technocratic paradigm. Otherwise, even the best ecological initiatives can find themselves caught up in the same globalized logic. To seek only a technical remedy to each environmental problem which comes up is to separate what is in reality interconnected, and so to mask the true and deepest problems of the global system. And to do that, really, you have to have a population who understands these things. And we have spent decades now doing our best to eliminate that type of education from the curriculum at all levels. As an educator, I can say that, I think, pretty confidently. Well, it's no wonder that we have problems with citizenship now. All right. So he says, all of this shows the urgent need for us to move forward. In a bold cultural revolution. Man, did he pick the wrong words there, right? And in Spanish, it's the same. So it's not the translator. Okay. So, I mean, he probably knew exactly what he was doing, and maybe he just wanted to really make a splash there. But when you hear Cultural Revolution, I'm sure many of you think of China, and that didn't turn out too well. Obviously, he's not talking about that, but he's talking about exactly what the term really represents, a revolution in our culture, in the way that we think and what we value. So he says, nobody is suggesting a return to the Stone Age, thank goodness, but we do need to slow down and look at reality in a different way to appropriate the positive and sustainable progress which has been made, but also recover the values and the great goals that were swept away by our unrestrained delusions of grandeur. There, I think he's saying the values and the goals were spiritual, okay? That what we've neglected is spiritual growth. And I think cultural growth is an extension of spiritual growth. And that has been greatly stunted as we've, tried very hard for material growth. But we have this whole like undiscovered country almost of spiritual growth and social growth that could take place if we could make this change. Okay. So here's one of my favorite of all, thinkers, Jacques Ellul, who was all about kind of like the automaticity of technology, how it becomes this self-moving, dominating thing that dominates human beings. So this is something that we've just, from this perspective, we've got to get a hold of this. We need to make it work for us rather than us working for it. And he basically says we cannot, continue to treat people like a part of the machine and then expect them to have all this sensitivity to other human beings and the environment. Okay. If we lose respect for God's creation, the environment, and each other, and worship material development, we will, of course, have abortion, the rising identitarianism in all of its forms as people seek to create themselves. Okay. So we need to get a grip on our goals, our values, who we are as human beings, and then move outward. Okay. He talks about people needing dignified work. Our technology has actually come to exploit us and dumbed our jobs down and eliminated many, many jobs, creating economic crises. It's exploited the labor of people in the global South. He says we need to stop driving small farmers and subsistence farmers out of business. This is well underway. I mean, it's almost over at this point in the United States. He argues that we need to avoid indiscriminate use of genetic modification of plants and people. But when used in crops, he says it often leads to productive land concentrated into the hands of a few owners. So he's talking there about the tendency we have to allow the market economy and, automation to just eliminate work, dehumanize work, throw people into poverty, and then, of course, tell them that they need to retool and start over again repeatedly throughout their lives. This is what we need to, among the things we need to fix. And he's saying you cannot ask people to care about the environment. It's all connected. You can't ask people to care about that and about each other if they're being treated like a part of the machine or inconsequential or expendable. All right, so we're halfway through. That's all I wanted to say about chapter 3. We're halfway through the book. That's an outline of the first 3 parts. And at this point, we've got about a half an hour for like questions and comments.